a society that currently argues in the West that men can be women, that inequality of results automatically means discrimination, that evil terrorist groups and moral armies are engaged in cycles of violence. Is this a truly better or more moral society? The answer, of course, is no. We must return to Jerusalem. We must never forget Jerusalem. For so long as it remains in our hearts, so will the God in whose image we were created.
If you've ever wondered how Jerusalem is connected to the Jewish people, this next video will explain everything you need to know. Please don't skip and watch all the way through. Before we get started, how are you guys doing? My name is Official Sahar TV, and I am coming to you live with another great video. Please don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe to this YouTube channel. We're almost at 50,000 subscribers, so don't forget to do so if you're enjoying the content. Let's get started.
Tonight, I want to talk about the importance of Jerusalem, of Yerushalayim. Not merely the city of Jerusalem, Yer HaKodesh, Yer Zahav, the center of the spiritual universe, but the concepts that sprang from Jerusalem and that have shaped the world we all live in, whether we believe in the God of the Bible or whether we don't. The modern world likes to think of itself as rooted in reason, and our pseudo-intellectuals like to think of reason as completely separate from religious principle. Their basic idea seems to be that religion inhibits thought, that religion enshrines the traditional at the cost of the creative, that it disparages science, that it re-enshrines bigotry, as we hear all the time about the Bible and people who believe in the Bible. This has been the lie at the center of nearly every modern revolutionary movement since the French Revolution. That the triumph of religion means a dark age, that abolition of religion means the full flowering of humanity, that destroying Jerusalem will lead to a better world. As we'll discuss in a few minutes, precisely the opposite is true. But to understand just why humanity liberated from religious principle ends in concentration camps, we have to first understand what Jerusalem brought to the world in the first place. In approximately 1313 BCE, according to traditional biblical belief, God spoke to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, at Har Sinai. He spoke from the smoke and the sound of the shofar, and he declared fundamental truths that are unreachable by reason alone. Those fundamental truths were essentially three. First, the Torah claimed that God was one, was unified. Second, the Torah claimed that human beings would be held to a standard of morality, morality springing from God's will, not from our own ideas of what is moral, and that we have the ability to choose how we act because we are made in God's image. And finally, the Torah claimed that God chose a particular nation with which to show the world's universal values, and that the history of that nation would exemplify the progress of humanity. Let's address each of the Torah's contentions in turn. First, the Torah argues that God is one. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. This was a radical sea change from the pagan belief systems that preceded the Bible. Those pagan belief systems contended that multiple gods ruled an utterly chaotic universe. Now, this explanation of the universe was both politically advantageous and also explanatory. It was politically advantageous because it allowed pagan cultures to merely integrate new gods into the religious superstructure. Right? If you're the Greeks or you're the Romans, you come along, you find a new god, and suddenly that becomes part of your pantheon. It allows you to absorb other peoples. And it was explanatory because it answered the question as to why the world seems so confusing. If the world is a reasonable place, why is everything so chaotic? The Torah rejected all of this. The Torah argued that there is one God. The first of the 10 Commandments was simple and direct. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. God was the first and the last, the creator. What's more, God's singularity meant that intolerance for untruth had to be pursued. Paganism promoted tolerance and diversity above truth. The Torah argued that truth must triumph, that there is one truth, and that God represents the highest truth. What's more, the Torah argued that God rules over a universe governed by his will, his singular will, a prime mover. A singular God instead of myriad gods, a panoply of gods, would require that logic governs the universe, a predictable set of rules discernible by the human mind. And indeed, that is the precise claim of the Torah. Lo b'shamayim hi, it's not in the heavens. It's here for us to learn and for us to discover. The universe isn't random. The rules are generally understandable. The Bible isn't just a set of stories designed to explain why the rain falls and the sun shines. Instead, the Bible lays forth for the first time an argument for the internal logic of the universe. God created that universe step by step. He governs that universe in a fashion we can investigate. In Bereshit, in Genesis, the patriarch Abraham asks God to abide by his own rules for right and wrong, for example. When God says that he wants to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham argues with God over right and wrong. He asks God whether collective punishment is appropriate if there are still good people living in the city. And God answers him. God doesn't merely ignore Abraham or silence him. Instead, God engages with man. In a chaotic world with no master moral values, the story of Abraham makes no sense. Now, Judaism doesn't claim that we're capable of understanding all of God's motives or actions. We can't understand all of the rules. In Exodus, Moses specifically asks God to show him his face, and God refuses, saying, "You can't see my face, for no one can see my face and live." This metaphor is God's way of saying that we humans cannot completely understand God. But God does have a standard, even if we can't fully comprehend it. Right? God's answer is that he's going to walk in front of Moses, and Moses will be able to see his back. He'll be able to see the knot of his tefillin in the Talmud. God doesn't randomly change his standards. He is the rock, his ways are perfect, all his ways are just, a faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he. The notion of a moral universe is a Judaic creation. It's woven into the name of Israel itself. Yisrael, of course, means struggle with God. And God wants human beings to struggle with him, because that is our task on earth, to try and understand God's moral standard and then enact it. Second, we know from the Torah that God demands that we act morally, that we have the ability to choose because we're created in God's image and God is inherently creative. Before the Bible, man was cosmic chattel, a speck, brooded about by the forces of the divine. The gods didn't expect much of man beyond simple bribery, every so often burn an animal carcass, and that was pretty much as good as it was going to get. There was no linkage between what we would deem moral behavior and divine expectation. The gods were arbitrary. They were not chained to rules. Human behavior wasn't tied to divine behavior. The Bible offered a different perspective. A singular God meant a singular standard for behavior. Consequences were supposed to be life lessons, meant to teach us to be moral. Sin had consequences, and by the way, does have consequences in the real world. Now, that didn't mean that every sin would be punished with prompt and proportional consequence, because God doesn't play whack-a-mole with human sin. But it does mean that following God's commandments would usually lead to better life results than doing the opposite. Polytheism argued that the gods were holy and thus human beings ought to serve them. Judaism argued that we ought to be holy in imitation of God. And Judaism argued that we had the ability to choose to be holy. Polytheism had little notion of the value of individual human beings. This wasn't true for the rulers in polytheistic cultures who were ranked among the gods themselves. You look back to basically any ancient country, from Egypt to Mesopotamia to Rome. If you look at any of them, the leaders were the people who mattered. They were made in the image of God. Literally, they would say this in all of their writings. Epic heroes of the ancient myths are identified with the gods. Commoners never even appear in the narratives. The Torah fought the notion of human inequality before God tooth and nail. We are all created equal before God in our endowment with a certain level of free will. Perhaps most importantly, the most important sentence in human history was this from Bereshit Aleph Kav Zayin, right? Genesis 1:27. God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Instead of a ruling caste with the power of free will, now all human beings, each and every one of us, was granted the value of choice. God stamped us all, breathed life into all of us, formed us out of the clay, out of the ground. The creation story itself is designed to demonstrate how the first man, Adam, used his innate power of choice wrongly, and we are all Adam's descendants. One of the most moving segments of the Bible takes place just before Cain slays his brother Abel. God sees that Cain is jealous that Abel's offering has already been accepted. And God passionately informs Cain, "Why are you annoyed? Why has your countenance fallen? Is it not so that if you improve, it will be forgiven you? If you do not improve, however, sin lies at the entrance, and it longs for you, but you can rule over it." There's a constant recurring theme in the Chumash. God lays out the importance of choice, of proper exercise of free will. He says in Dvarim, "See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. And now choose life so that you and your children may live." Because we choose, we are God's partners in creation. We're signatories to a covenant with God in which we have to play our role and choose to abide by our commitments. And free choice is the central element. When God brought the Jews out of Egypt and stood them before Sinai, he required them to sign on to the program. And they made an affirmative decision to contract with God, and they did so without even waiting to hear the terms. Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear. Freely willed action even preceded justification. The third lesson of the Torah is that history progresses. And the Torah uses the people of Israel as an example of that divine presence in history. Now, history in a lot of cultures has no beginning and no end. Greek thought saw the universe as permanent and moving in circular fashion. History would recur, and then it would grow, and then it would decay, and then recur and grow and decay. There could be no vision of a progression in history, an inexorable movement toward a better time or a messianic era. Progress itself was, for many of the ancients, an illusion. Or not even that. It was an idea that had no place in the rational universe. That view of history was not unique to the Greeks. It was true of the ancient Babylonians, Native American cultures, Hinduism, Buddhism. The Bible takes a fundamentally different view. The Bible immediately sets God in the context of a time-bound history. God, of course, exists outside of time, but he's intimately involved in creating progress. The Jewish creation story notes that God intervenes day by day to create new levels of complexity in the material world, and then he rests. When God intervenes in the world, it is to better the lot of mankind or to teach lessons. God inserts himself in history by preserving Noah and his family. He restrains himself from stopping history ever again by destroying his creatures, no matter their choices. God manifests himself to Abraham to send the first monotheist on a journey to a place Abraham doesn't know. And God then makes a covenant with Abraham to build him up into a great and mighty nation connected with a particular parcel of land, Eretz Yisrael. God chooses Abraham. He chooses Isaac, he chooses Jacob, and then he chooses the people of Israel to act as exemplars of morality across history, to spread his word with Moses as his prophet. God says, "You are to be holy to me because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the nations to be my own." The story of history is the story of God's romance with his chosen nation, his decision to take that nation out of slavery and bring it forth into freedom, to use that nation as a vehicle for the transmission of his message. God says, has any God ever tried to take for himself one nation out of another nation by signs and by wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, or by great and awesome deeds like all the things the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? But, of course, history isn't linear. The plot has twists and turns. The story of humanity is the story of the romance between an honorable God and a straying nation, a nation that knows better but has to learn and relearn to love God once more, and a God who occasionally hides his face but waits patiently for his people to return to him. With each relearning comes progress, a movement toward that historical finish line. We are all part of the great drama of history. History gives us a place. It gives us a rationale. We may live as individuals, but we're part of the tapestry of time, the great chain of history. And even if our thread comes to an inglorious end, God weaves with us. History, in short, can progress. It can progress because God cares about us as individuals and because he's invested in our history. And the Torah argues that the eventual culmination of history will come with a universal recognition of God and his handiwork, with the Jews as the treasured jewel shining forth light from Jerusalem, from this city. These three arguments have created the modern world because God is one. The universe is worth exploring and investigating, and our minds mirror God's to the extent that we can discover many of his laws. In this basic principle lies the root of science. Because God gave us free will and demands of us morality, we have to pursue virtue within the context of freedom. Tyranny is an imposition on our individuality, but libertinism, the perversion of liberty, is a betrayal of our holiness. The notion of ordered liberty began at Sinai. Because God tells us that history progresses and that progress is possible, he demands of us that we pursue it. And because God chooses a people as his example, he tells us we have to understand that progress can be achieved in a number of ways, with respect for those of other nations and cultures, and an understanding that there are certain moral values that stand above all of us. The roots of international order begin with the morally justified nation, now with a cadre of experts who sit atop some sort of international institution and tell us all what to do. Now, we are in the process, unfortunately, in the West, of caricaturing the Bible, of mocking it, of forgetting it. The root text of the West is being abandoned in favor of a sort of free-floating rationalism, this idea that we can come up with anything out of our minds. Without the premises of Sinai, that rationalism collapses in on itself like a dying star. After all, what good does reason do in a godless, reasonless, purposeless universe? This is a discussion I've frequently had with Sam Harris, who likes to argue that we can simply use our minds and our reason to suss out everything there is to know about the universe. And I've always said to him, I don't understand how he can claim that there's such a thing as absolute truth outside the context of an absolute. If all we are evolutionarily adaptive creatures, there's nothing there that speaks to the idea of an absolute truth that human beings can grasp. There's what's evolutionarily adaptive and what's evolutionarily not. Rationality without that higher purpose means nothing. What can reason actually accomplish if we aren't so much godly creatures as those evolutionarily adaptive animals, incapable of seeking or understanding any higher truths, truths that actually don't exist in any case? What sort of progress is possible when we don't have any common standards of right and wrong? The only progress possible is utopian world breaking, which we saw in the 20th century, or a regression back to paganism. Again, the 20th century was the story of rationalism without religion, and it ended in gas chambers and gulags. A world liberated from the premises of the Bible built all of that. After all, progress could not be achieved by adherence to the wisdom of tradition, but by breaking eggs to make omelets. Forget particularism, forget nationality, the world said. Instead, universalism had to triumph through universal application of power. Right? One nation or another would dominate all the others. Hundreds of millions of people died for these ideas. Our century is the story of the latter problem, the regression back to paganism. We are reverting to tolerant lies, promoted by self-appointed kings who soar above the restrictions of other human beings. Human beings aren't made in the image of God, only the experts are made in the image of God. We don't have free will, only they have free will. There's no such thing as an absolute truth, there is only what the experts tell us. We have returned to an era when gods ruled us from above, not through rules, not through reason, not even through explaining themselves, but through sheer power, when chaos was the order of the day. Now, can we truly argue that we as a society are better off now that we've abandoned Jerusalem? Is our society a society that currently argues in the West that men can be women, that inequality of results automatically means discrimination, that evil terrorist groups and moral armies are engaged in cycles of violence? Is this a truly better or more moral society? The answer, of course, is no. We must return to Jerusalem. We must never forget Jerusalem. For so long as it remains in our hearts, so will the God in whose image we were created. In the words of Isaiah, Ki mitzion tetze Torah u'devar Hashem miYerushalayim, the Torah will come forth from Zion, and the word of God from Yerushalayim. Thank you so much.
Zion, by the way, if you're anti-Zionist, Zion means it's a mountain in Jerusalem where Temple Mount was built on, the holiest site for the Jews. The act of Zionism is the will to that mountain, to Zion, to Jerusalem. And we say it every morning when we put tefillin on, that we want to go back to Jerusalem. When you go to Jerusalem, you feel this strong spiritual experience that you don't feel anywhere else in the world. Doesn't matter if you're a Jew, Christian, Muslim, Jerusalem is the most powerful, spiritually powerful city in the world. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please don't forget to subscribe. We're almost at 50,000 subscribers. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.